welcome to the next episode of Africa Talks, where we talk about Africa, the continent, and its people. Today, we'll be talking about the post-COVID-19 scenario and what kind of opportunities and challenges for Africa could be there when it comes to the new global order. And today with me, there are three panelists joining me from different parts of the world. First of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Raymond Lau Koon Son. Dr. Raymond, welcome to the show.
Hi, hello.
Dr. Raymond is joining us from Hong Kong. He's lecturer in the Department of History in the Baptist University of Hong Kong. And his research areas include African and Chinese relationship. So we'll look forward to get new insights about Africa and China, Dr. Raymond, from you during this hour-long discussion. So welcome to our show.
Thank you.
Our second panelist today is Mr. Chigozie Udensi, who is joining us from Nigeria, from Abuja. Mr. Udensi is an academic in African migration studies and is also as well as a brand and marketing strategist. And we look forward to hear you today and your views about what is in store in Africa's future in the post-COVID-19 world. And we have a permanent guest in our show, Mr. Izzy Ogunamdi.
Thank you.
Who is a keen promoter of Pan-Africanism and also co-founder of Exilient Africa. So all of you, welcome to this episode of Africa Talks. Gentlemen, in the last 5 to 6 months, when this epidemic started from Wuhan in China, it has traveled to more than 200 countries now, and causing serious socio-economic impacts in several countries where millions and millions of people are getting, like in India, people are migrating from cities to villages because there are no employment opportunities for next 2-3 months. A lot of developments and changes are taking place in different countries of the world. A major development that we have seen apart from economic hardships is that globally there has been a power tussle between China and USA. We saw it in the context of WHO also, where China on April 14th, Mr. Trump announced that they are no longer going to fund WHO. And it's extremely important because US has been the most important and biggest funder of WHO in the last few years. And as compared to US, China contribute a very little amount to WHO. And after a few days, it came to our notice that China has also announced that they'll be contributing another $300 million since US has stopped funding WHO. So a kind of power tussle has started in the international arena. So how do you see it in the context of the post-COVID world? What is your observation? I know there can't be a lot of clarity as of now. There will be a lot of unpredictability that how things will turn out after the COVID-19 is over. But can we see some trends emerging of the new global order that we can see in the next maybe 2 years or 5 years time? So I would like to go first to Dr. Raymond for his comments.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you for inviting me and a very kind introduction. Really happy to be here joining this panel discussion with other outstanding panelists from across the world. So for today's panel discussion, as the editor-in-chief has just kindly introduced me, so I would like to in particular share my observations of Africa's engagement with China and also some other major powers and partners, and also what Pan-African solidarity and Africa for the post COVID-19 world. Okay, talking about the key priorities for Africa in its engagement with the world. Obviously, this COVID-19, I think, has has been a situation, okay, a very serious situation facing countries across the world. I guess for the very first time, okay, the very popular saying, "United we stand, divided we fall," no longer rings true because of the social distancing, right? Anyway, but I think, in my opinion, like Africa has always played an important and often vital role, okay, in international politics, despite the myth of marginality and irrelevance. Of course, the problem facing Africa, African countries, is the continent has always been driven by lots of dominant international and geopolitical agendas, say from after colonialism, we've got the Cold War, and then the post-Cold War, we got with countries in Africa facing the pressure of globalization, and after 9/11, we've got African countries being driven into this agenda of counterterrorism. So I think for African countries, the key priority, first of all, in my opinion, is about tackling or transforming its culture of dependency. In other words, African countries definitely they can stop relying too much, okay, on any major partners, again, not including China and including US and other major powers. But in fact, okay, African countries, they can definitely take charge of the affairs of themselves. And I would definitely, in the later stage, I will share my observation more, in particular the China's policy towards Africa in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, maybe at a later stage. Yeah.
Great. So let's go to Mr. Izioga Namdi. Mr. Namdi, what's your observation about what could be in store for Africa in the post-COVID-19 global scenario?
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Well, I think key priorities, just like Mr. Raymond has mentioned, Dr. Raymond, one of the key priority would be resolving the issue around dependency. Africa actually moving, the entirety of Africa actually moving towards a self-dependent continent. And we can actualize that through investment in youth and particularly capacity building, because we need to build capacity, human capacity, and also appreciate local content. That's things that are produced locally. So if you see the Madagascar Prime Minister, I think, had recently made a comment with regards to the international community not adopting the COVID organic drug that has been manufactured there in Madagascar. And there was even a statement that was issued by the World Health Organization for Africa that the drug hasn't been properly tested, so it shouldn't be consumed. But there is that Pan-African solidarity where the entirety of the African continent, the president and governments have adopted this product also, because I think at the moment there is no cure for the COVID-19. So I think for us to move towards that self-dependency and self-sufficiency, sustainable systems, we need to build capacity, and we can only do that through investment in youth. So I'll share further on the topic as we proceed.
Great. Our third panelist today is Mr. Chigozie Udensi, who is joining us from Abuja. Mr. Udensi, what would you like to say about the changing global world order, and is it going to be a good opportunity for Africa to assert its own interests and rights in the coming years?
Thank you for having me on the show, and I'm really excited being here today. So with regards to your topic, I would build a synergy on what what Dr. Raymond has said and what Namdi has also mentioned, this is an important time for Africa to come together, first of all, to build synergy, to build cooperations, and stand as, of course, they cannot stand to match the world powers, but they can stand to build an ally, to build their own force. Other countries will be providing aid to Africa to say, hey, come take this and enrich your economy, or here we're offering a loan to sustain you during this COVID-19 period. However, this is also a time for Africa to look inward and say, if countries are offering, how can we use these resources to change the lives of our citizens, to empower our citizens? And if our citizens have the ability to empower themselves, then how can we support them to also improve our lives, to also improve ourselves as Africans? So this is a situation in most African countries, and I believe that most African leaders are also on this trail, where they want to understand how they can empower their own people.
Great. I got your point, Mr. Odense. There was some audio issue there. So basically, what I could sense from all three panelists who are here with us today in this discussion is that it's about empowering Africa. Empowering in terms of the economy, empowering in terms of investing in the youth of Africa, so that Africa as a continent can assert itself in a more powerful way in the coming years. That brings me to another important aspect of Africa vis-a-vis the two most important powers of the world, that is USA and China. As we have seen, a kind of a global tussle has started between these two countries. And if we see that in the context of Africa, Africa, both US and China have been playing a very important role from the last several decades. However, the trajectory of diplomatic and economic and business relations between USA and China and Africa and China, if you look at that trajectory shows completely different, results. I'll give you one example. If you look at the year 2000, in the year 2000, the three most important trade partners of Africa were number one, USA, number two, France, and number three, Italy. Now, if we see what happened after 17 years, in 2017, the three major trade partners of Africa were number one, China, number two, India, and number three, France. USA has completely disappeared from there. So a kind of a different, development has taken place in last 20 years, the way China has engaged with Africa and the way US has engaged with Africa. So first of all, let's focus about China. And Dr. Raymond, coming to you, if you can give us an overview how China has been developing its relationship with Africa over the years, and whether Africa has benefited out of that relationship, or it has been only one-sided relationship, which we can term as an economic colonialism of China also. Can we say it like that?
Sure. Talking about China's engagement with Africa, definitely this is not something entirely new. I mean, as we are all aware of this, that China has long positioned itself as the enthusiastic supporter of the Africa's liberation movement during the decolonization. But as we can see, it was not until the year 2000 that we have witnessed the what I call the institutionalization and the formalization of China's 50 years relationship with Africa. I'm referring to the establishment of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, the FOCAC. And just take 2018, the FORGAF summit, for example. What we are talking about here is some 53 out of 54 countries participating in the summit. I think Swaziland was the only exception, right? So I think in this sense, I think China's efforts to institutionalize and also formalize its relationship with Africa has been very successful in this sense. And if there is any so-called benefits that African countries can get through its engagement with China, perhaps the only benefit that I can observe in this sense is the infrastructure building, or the so-called China's model of economic development. Right? And this is actually something the Chinese government has been actively promoting to the African countries. Okay, if there is such a thing called China model, that would be something like a country can become economically prosperous without becoming liberal democratic. And so that comes, in my opinion, this is another, this is the, maybe I would say the dark side, right? Or say of China's engagement with Africa. I think it's also many of us aware of this, right? China's policy towards Africa is something like business is business. Right? There's no conditionalities being attached, just not like the so-called Western approach whatsoever. But exactly because of this business is business approach, the problem, in my opinion, facing Africa's political development is definitely it would not be beneficial. It would not be beneficial for the democratic development of African countries. I think particularly concerning for me is the so-called precedent for life, precedent for life phenomenon. As we have noticed, some of the longest serving heads of states, actually quite a number of those are coming from African countries. And in this context, I think China's engagement with African countries definitely is not helpful in this aspect, in my opinion. Yeah, so I think this is what I would see the so-called benefits, but also the disadvantage in terms of China's engagement with African countries.
Coming to you, Dr. Raymond was saying that China means business when it deals with Africa. But do you think, in addition to business, in trade and everything, China has also been keeping its geostrategic and geoeconomic interests as a priority area in dealing with Africa?
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Raymond, you want to say something? Yeah, Dr. Raymond, you can continue, and then we can go to Mr. Eziogu.
Oh, sure. Actually, the one thing that I would like to add, perhaps, is the Chinese government's purpose of incorporating Africa into the Belt and Road Initiative, despite the existence of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, is about demonstrating China's system self-confidence and belief that the country can offer a Chinese model of economic development for African countries. So this is another point that I would like to make.
Great. Mr. Eziogu.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Narendra. But as a student of anthropology and the race and the racisms and the politics of the world, I think talking about China, USA, India, particularly India, because I haven't been here for a while, I've experienced a side of India that actually connotes what Africa holds. And that is something that is very interesting because it has to do with our relationship, our culture, our way of life, our systems, our traditions and practice, you know, and the origin of human migration and civilization through Africa. You know, India has always been a close place where the Africans stepped in. So I think in terms of that relationship, India coming into the picture has to do with the massive diplomacy that the government of India and the rest of the world has been playing in terms of internationalization. So Africa, with its relationship with India, feels more closely in dealing with India than this other West and China in particular. But why we still have these ones there is because of, for some reasons, that includes imperialism, where you have people who are former colonial masters using all their might to also suppress independent sovereign countries. But in terms of the people, the African people, I think what the African man has to do is to look inwards. We've done this before. Our leaders have done this before. In the times of Thomas Sankara, we had a kind of a revolution in Burkina Faso that led to people of Burkina Faso doing things for themselves. If you look at even in Nigeria, there's a place called Aba in Nigeria. You see a lot of innovations going on there. You go far to the north, you see a lot of things being done in Kano State where people do things for themselves. And this is not just in this country, it spreads across Africa. And our own systems are systems that are very, very democratic, I mean, pre-colonization. But the challenge right now has been, just like you mentioned, people coming in to give us their own standard of what development should look like. Previously, it was the West. Now it's Asia, particularly China. You know, the Chinese system has to be imposed if we want to give you loans, and there is no form of accountability. There is no mutuality or respect in the relationship. You look at what is even happening during the COVID-19. All gratitude to India for even allowing Africans to stay without chasing people out on the streets and throwing them to isolation centers just because of their origin. So I really think that in the future, India would, if strategically played, take a place in this relationship that would cement what Africa and India, the future holds for us.
True. I think that's a very relevant point you have talked about. But if you focus on China, you know, the kind of investment China has been making in African countries, do you think it's helpful in the short run, but in the longer run, somehow it is stifling Africa's own economic growth? Because China is utilizing the natural resources that are available there. China is bringing its own labor. China, the whole African market is now getting open for Chinese products. So do you think in the long run, African countries have a lot of things to lose if they continue like this kind of imbalanced relationship with China? Anyone can take up that question.
Okay. So first of all, you must understand that China's relationship with Africa, just like Dr. Raymond says, is business for business. Now, they're here for business. They understand that Africa has a wide market which they can benefit heavily from because China has very cheap labor and they have a lot to gain from business with Africa. So in the long run, I don't really think that China would want to relinquish that opportunity, or I don't think China would want to let go of that market which they have been able to create for themselves, that niche market. And I believe all their business strategies and all their investments in Africa is geared towards sustaining the relationship they have with Africa. So in the long run, I don't see this as a good measure. However, in the short run, the palliatives are good. The aid is good. China's construction works in Africa, in Nigeria particularly, is excellent. We love it. But in the long run, I don't know how that's going to play out. I mean, I can't really say for now, but the politics of tomorrow will tell.
Yeah, but yeah, if I'll just step in here,
Yes.
Chigo, you know also that when we now look at the Pan-African aspect, if you see what the African Union has done, I think the whole 55 countries have signed in on this free trade zone area. It might be also that this has been pushed by powers from the other side, that we have a more controlled market so that they can play their games very well. But looking from the Pan-African perspective and the way the African man thinks, because despite all what we've been through, you see that we try our best to want to do things, innovate things for ourselves. We try to want to patronize our own. Most of our things are cost effective because they are manufactured by ourselves. We could maintain them. So I think we are moving from that stage where because of the infrastructure, because we also have ways which we construct our own things. So there's a point where it gets to that the entirety of the market will decide that we do not want to deal with these individuals because the relationship has not been mutual. That's why we need to preach to them also that mutuality and respect in our relationship at this time is very, very important. It's sacrosanct to maintaining what is going on between us. If this continues whereby there's not that mutuality, I think people would wake up and demand you not, that they don't want to do anything with you. And if government gets involved, then it's a big loss.
Okay,
So that reminds me, yeah. Yeah,
well,
please go.
I wanted to counter that just a bit, because I personally don't think that a situation like that can come up anytime soon, because from the records, or from what is playing out here, we understand that Africans, especially in Nigeria, we have our own market and a way of generating our own goods and services. But then you should also understand that there's a politics of power playing on here, and the only way that they benefit, the leaders or the people in power sometimes benefit from this politics of power, is from internally generated revenue. Now, where is the money coming in from? Why is the money coming in? What is the relationship sustaining this money coming in? Now, that's what we're talking about: the contracts, the business, the relationship between China and Nigeria, China and Uganda, China and Rwanda, China and any other country. That's part of the relationship that China is trying to sustain, where they have free access to your economy, where they have free access to importing their own goods into your country, regardless of your ability to provide those goods for your people. Now, that's where China comes in.
Okay, so that's a big opportunity for China. So, after listening to you, it reminds me of a discussion that in Africa, if there is any building which has more than 3 floors and any road which is more than 3 kilometers in length, there is a high possibility that it has been constructed by a Chinese company. So that's how China has, that's how China has entered into Africa.
But that is changing. That is changing.
That's good if it's changing.
Yeah,
that's good.
I mean, also if you look into the construction of the African Union headquarters, right, by the Chinese, I think that was built in 2012.
Okay.
Right, and that was being celebrated as a new era for Africa. But I'm seeing this from an African point of view. I think it is more like a source of shame, right? Because that exposed the fact that some 50 plus members of the organization would not pay for their own headquarters, but instead of having the Chinese paying for that. But anyway, yeah. This is I share the concern with Chico. That's why in the long run.
I totally agree. If we have a look at what kind of money China is pumping in Africa, it will give us some idea that, China is going to stay here for a longer time. China is Africa's biggest trade partner right now. And the annual trade between African continent and China has been of $200 billion per year. That is the trade. There are more than 10,000 Chinese companies working in Africa. More than $1 billion has been given by China for under its Belt and Road, Africa Finance Scheme,
Hmm.
and a whooping $60 billion have been given as African aid by China. That's lots and lots of money that is coming in Africa through China. So that shows that China is going to be there for a very long time, and I think China's hegemonic role is going to stay in the post-COVID scenario also. That brings me to another aspect, very interesting development that took place in last 3-4 years. What has happened is there has been a new scramble for Africa. It seems like that. Between 2010 and 2016, in the last 6 years, almost 300 new embassies have opened in different African countries. So that shows a kind of, emerging interest of several countries in Africa. Maybe it's African trade, maybe other potentialities in Africa of investment that they can see. But this is something which is going to have a huge impact on African economy and African politics.
Well, if I'll get what Mr. Narendra was talking about.
So how do you look at it, this whole development?
All right. Yeah. So if I get what you're talking about, the scramble for Africa. So I think this happened since the 1914 Berlin Conference, and we thought that was it when we got into the 1960s and 1958, the independence era. But now we are seeing a different system because this scramble which we're talking about, it's more of new scramblers or new masters, people who just like we're calling China right now. So it's a different era for Asia particularly. And it was then that we realized that the pyramid is changing its shape from the West and the rest to now maybe the West, Asia, and then the rest, which we would still remain on that category. But I think this is not going to work because the day you tell a child that he has been destined to be a perpetual heir of food and fetcher of water, that day is the day his fight for freedom begins. So I think a lot of the Africans, particularly the youths, have come to that realization that we cannot have another experience of colonization, despite we have these resources. That's why you see we're preaching more from the angle of mutuality and respect. See, we're not saying we cannot share because we need things that you have that we do not have, but it should be mutual. It shouldn't be one-sided. This is all what we're saying. So the mineral resources are there. They are enormous. They are not finishing anytime. Even there are so many untapped, so many undiscovered yet. So I think what the world needs is just to realize that the role that Africa plays and respect Africa, because in so many of the relationships, that respect is not there. And sometimes we look at our leadership as the problem, which also it's not far from it. But I think we're coming to that stage. Youths are taking their role in government these days, and a lot of things are changing. People are becoming more aware. So that scramble will never happen. We might be binded, but we would always get free.
Dr. Raymond, would you like to add something there about this so-called new scramble for Africa?
I think for me, my observation is this is a test for African leaders and their people. I mean, the debate surrounding this so-called new scramble for Africa is about whether, following some 50 years of independence since the colonization, I mean, the issue perhaps here is about whether African countries would once again allow themselves to become a so-called neo-colonial carcass for this Eastern forces, say China, or whether African countries can genuinely become an autonomous agent, right, for their own destiny and self-determination. I think this is a genuine concern for me. But I share with the concern. I mean the view with the panelists that there will not be another scramble for Africa. Definitely, that's for sure.
That's great. So that brings me to the last discussion of this episode. It is estimated that towards the end of this century, African continent will have 40% of global population and 42% of young working population. That will be the highest in the world, which will be residing in Africa. Already the rate of urbanization in Africa is quite high. And a lot of steps have been taken by respective governments in Africa to improve intra-African trade and free movement of goods and services. A very ambitious document that was released by African Union was Agenda 2063. Do you think that this is going to be a very big opportunity for Africa in the next 50 years? The kind of young population they'll have, the kind of resources they'll have, the kind of big market, because the middle class in Africa is going to boom in the next 30, 40 years. Do you think are African nations ready to take advantage of this situation in the next 30, 40 years? Or do you think power players like USA and China or Russia or Middle East will take away the pie? Mr. Iziogo.
Well,
after that we'll come to Mr. Udensi.
Yeah, for the African Union Agenda 2063,
yeah.
If you'd recall also, we had the investment in youth, capacity building, and harnessing the demographic dividends through investment in youth. We had the Africa return to Africa campaign also, that was just last year. I think what Africa actually needs right now, which is the same thing we keep emphasizing on, and in so many ways we've tried also, because we're not just speaking to those in the power, we're also speaking to the youths themselves of today. We just need to realize that we need to start creating for ourselves. There is a new system that is coming in place right now, just like the COVID-19 has offered us, ushered us actually into. So I think we have to realize that it's time for us to, instead of wait to go for white collar jobs and the likes, we need to become innovative in our own approach, become job creators. And those of us who have the opportunity to see things from a different perspective, more telescopically, by virtue of our migration out of Africa, what we need to look at also is how we can give back to Africa, rather than going back to Africa and taking from Africa. We need to look at how we can give back to Africa, how we can have a ripple effect that would connect to a majority of the African youths like ourselves, and how we can have this network to usher Africa into that positions where it actually should be in the future, because we're not just talking about Africa's population alone. There's also going to be an influx of migration into Africa, because in the coming years, more Indians are going to want to be in Africa because of the lucrative ventures that are going to be sprouting up there. So I think if we don't do what we have to do right now, particularly the young ones, although the government might have not, they might be sleeping, but they need to really also wake up to that realization. You have to invest in youth, and this is a lifetime investment, capacity building, skills, and a lot of things. So
Great, I think that's a very important point coming from Iziogo about investing in skills of youth, providing them jobs, so that Africa can, change in next 40, 50 years. Now,
Exactly.
let's go to Mr. Chigo Udensi for his last comments. Mr. Udensi.
All right. Thank you very much. So when talking about the uniting of Africa through the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, right, to as a bolster to hold on African economy and build the African economy, I think we should first of all look at it regionally with the regional blocks. Is Africa prepared to be united, to stand as one economy, to stand as one regional power, you know, as opposed to the European economic powers and the Asian economic powers? Personally, I would like to look at it regionally, and I'd say some regions are prepared and others are not prepared. Just a month ago, there was a report from the Nigerian authorities. One of the Nigerian politicians wrote a report to the African Union saying that they should extend the application of the free trade agreement because of the COVID-19 pandemic going on right now. And I also read a response from an Ethiopian parliamentarian who opposed that, saying this is the best time to make preparations, to create guidelines for how it's going to roll out after the corona period. So when I built comparisons from both interaction, from the responses, I could tell you that from the Western Bloc, some countries may not be ready, but from the Eastern Bloc, some countries are definitely ready to roll out the African.
Great. I think that's another wonderful point of regional integration of countries for Africa's growth.
Economic integration is very important to consider when bringing in the issue of is Africa ready? So great. I think regional should get it ready first, get it right first before coming together as one.
Great. Dr. Raymond, your final words about Africa's economic and social development in the coming decades?
Sure. Actually, my observation about the potential future of Africa in the next coming decades is about whether African Union, as a successor of the OAU, I mean the Organization for African Unity, can qualitatively transform itself into a real, a genuine diplomatic voice on the world stage, other than just like a talking shop in the past when the OAU was established. And in my opinion, the African Union itself can potentially be a force for good in the world. I mean, if we look into the official document, right, the AU's proclaimed vision is for, and I quote, an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, okay, driven by its own citizens and representing a dynamic force in the global arena. And I mean, also, if you look into the constitutive act of the AU, in particular the Article 4H, actually what it means is about the confirmation of AU's right to interfere into domestic affairs of its member states in terms of human rights protection. And I think in many ways, this is a very important step being taken by AU in terms of promoting good governance and human rights protection and rules of law. So in my opinion, AU can be a force for good in the world, but what is needed here is about the African countries, their leaders, to have more involvement with the organization instead of just relying on those external donors or major powers. Yeah, this is. I think
that's a very important point you have raised. So what Africa need at this point of time is a leadership which knows what kind of decisions needs to be taken, for the next 20, 30 years. Africa has a huge young population. There is need for their skill development, for their jobs, for economic opportunities for them. And as Mr. Odensi pointed out, there is a huge scope for regional integration. The first step that is going to be is regional integration in making possible for entire African continent to come together as one. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today in this discussion. I hope that Africa becomes more assertive in the coming years, takes ownership for its own advancement, and put forward the priorities of its own people. So thank you so much, Dr. Raymond. Thank you so much, Mr. Iziogo and Mr. Chigo Odensi for joining us today in the 4th episode of Africa Talks. We'll be back again very soon on another issue and talk about more about Africa, the continent, and its people. Good night and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.